What if I told you that a 7-year-old boy, found wandering the streets of Istanbul in 1923, would change everything we thought we knew about one of history's most brutal empires? What if this child, who couldn't even write his own name, possessed memories so detailed and accurate that they would lead archaeologists to uncover treasures that had been lost for over 4 centuries? This is the story of Kemal Ozan, the orphan who remembered being Sultan Murad IV, the Mad King who once ruled the Ottoman Empire with such cruelty that his own mother tried to poison him. But Kemal's memories weren't just of palaces and gold. They were of something far darker, something so horrific that it had been deliberately erased from every historical record. The year was 1923. The Ottoman Empire had just collapsed, and Istanbul was a city of refugees and orphans. Among them was a peculiar boy named Kemal Ozan, found by charity workers near the ruins of Topkapi Palace. He was malnourished, spoke in an archaic dialect of Turkish that scholars could barely understand, and claimed to remember things that happened 300 years before he was born. At first, the authorities dismissed him as another traumatized war orphan, his mind broken by the horrors he had witnessed. But Kemal wasn't just making up stories. He was describing places, people, and events with an accuracy that defied explanation. He spoke of secret passages beneath the palace that no living person knew existed. He described the exact layout of chambers that had been sealed for centuries. Most disturbing of all, he recounted in vivid detail the reign of Sultan Murad IV, a ruler so violent that Ottoman historians had tried to erase him from memory. Dr. Elena Busquets, a Spanish archaeologist working in Istanbul, first heard about Kemal from a colleague who dismissed the boy as a curiosity. But when she met him, something chilled her to the bone. The child didn't just claim to remember being Sultan Murad. He demonstrated knowledge that only the Sultan himself could have possessed. Kemal described the exact location of Murad's private torture chamber, a room that existed in no historical record. He knew the names of concubines who had been executed in secret. He recounted conversations with his vizier that were never documented. Most unnervingly, he spoke of a hidden vault beneath the palace where Murad had stored something so precious and terrible that he trusted no one else to know its location. Dr. Vasquez decided to test the boy's claims. If Kemal truly possessed these memories, then the passages he described should exist. Using ground-penetrating radar, her team began scanning the areas beneath Topkapi Palace that the child had identified. What they found defied all expectations. The passages were real, every single one of them. Sealed chambers that hadn't been opened since the 17th century lay exactly where Kemal had said they would be. But, as they excavated deeper, following the boy's increasingly detailed directions, they uncovered something that would haunt Dr. Vasquez for the rest of her life. The first chamber they opened contained the remains of over 200 people. Men, women, and children, their skeletons arranged in perfect rows, as if they had been laid out for some macabre ceremony. The bones showed signs of systematic torture. Skulls had been trepanned while the victims were still alive. Rib cages were split open with surgical precision. These weren't the remains of executed criminals or war prisoners. Based on the quality of their clothing and jewelry, these had been members of the Ottoman nobility. Kemal, now 8 years old, stood in the chamber and calmly explained what they were seeing. These were the victims of what he called the Great Culling, a massacre that Sultan Murad had ordered to eliminate anyone who might challenge his rule. But this wasn't just political purging. Murad had been convinced that he could achieve immortality by consuming the life force of others, and he had devised increasingly elaborate methods of extracting what he believed to be the soul from living bodies. The second chamber contained Murad's laboratory, preserved exactly as he had left it. Ancient texts on alchemy and necromancy lined the walls. Surgical instruments of impossible complexity lay arranged on stone tables. Most disturbing were the glass vessels, hundreds of them, each containing what appeared to be human organs suspended in an unknown preservative. Labels written in Murad's own hand identified the contents and their supposed magical properties. But it was the third chamber that proved Kemal's most impossible claim. The child had insisted that Murad had discovered the secret of transferring consciousness from one body to another, and that he had used this knowledge to cheat death. The chamber contained what could only be described as an ancient operating theater, complete with restraining tables and a complex system of mirrors, arranged to focus moonlight onto the subject. The walls were covered in detailed diagrams showing the process Murad believed would allow him to move his soul into a younger body. The final diagram showed something that made Dr. Vasquez's blood run cold. It depicted the Sultan performing the ritual on himself, with a young boy as the recipient. According to Kemal, Murad had indeed attempted the transfer, but something had gone wrong. Instead of moving completely into a new body, his consciousness had become fragmented, scattered across time like seeds on the wind. The boy claimed that he wasn't the first to carry these memories. Throughout history, children had been born with fragments of Murad's consciousness, living and dying with the burden of the Sultan's horrific memories. The authorities tried to separate Kemal from the excavation, but the boy had become essential to the work. He was the only one who could navigate the increasingly complex network of chambers they were uncovering. Each new discovery validated more of his impossible knowledge, but also revealed the true scope of Murad's madness. They found rooms filled with the preserved bodies of children, each one showing signs of the same surgical procedures depicted in the diagrams. They discovered chambers where Murad had experimented on living subjects, trying to understand the nature of consciousness and death. Most horrifying was the final chamber, where they found Murad's own body, mummified and surrounded by mirrors, positioned as if he were still conducting some eternal ritual. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery came when Dr. Vasquez noticed something about the arrangement of the chambers themselves. When mapped from above, they formed a perfect spiral, with Murad's tomb at the center. The spiral matched exactly a symbol that Kemal had been unconsciously drawing since he was found, a symbol that appeared nowhere in Ottoman historical records. That as the excavation continued, Kemal began to change. The boy who had once been curious and eager to help became withdrawn and fearful. He started speaking in voices that weren't his own, using names and references that belonged to different time periods. Dr. Vasquez realized with growing horror that the deeper they dug, the more of Murad's consciousness seemed to be awakening within the child. The final chamber they uncovered contained something that challenged everything they thought they knew about life and death. It was a room filled with what could only be described as a primitive computer, built from mirrors, crystals, and human bones. Kemal explained that this was Murad's attempt to create a permanent vessel for consciousness, a machine that could house a human soul indefinitely. But the machine wasn't inactive. As they examined it, Dr. Vasquez noticed that the mirrors were still reflecting light in patterns that seemed almost alive. The crystals hummed with an energy that had no scientific explanation. And at the center of it all, suspended in a case of perfectly preserved glass, was a human brain that showed no signs of decay, despite being over 300 years old. Kemal approached the machine with a familiarity that terrified everyone present. He began manipulating controls that shouldn't have existed, activating mechanisms that defied understanding. As he worked, his voice changed completely, becoming deeper, more authoritative. When he spoke, it was no longer an 8-year-old boy talking. It was Sultan Murad IV, awakening after centuries of sleep. The excavation was immediately sealed. The Turkish government classified all findings as state secrets. Dr. Vasquez was sworn to secrecy, and her research was confiscated. But she managed to smuggle out one thing: a journal documenting everything they had discovered. What happened to Kemal Ozan remains unknown. Official records claim he died of pneumonia in 1924, just 1 year after his discovery. But Dr. Vasquez's journal tells a different story. She believes that Kemal didn't die. She believes that Sultan Murad finally completed his centuries-long ritual, and that somewhere in the world, a child walks around with the full consciousness of one of history's most evil rulers. The most chilling part of Dr. Vasquez's account comes in her final entry. She writes that in the weeks following the excavation, she began having dreams. Dreams where she was someone else, someone who lived centuries ago, in a palace filled with screaming. Dreams where she knew things she had never learned, remembered conversations she had never had. She began researching other archaeological discoveries, looking for patterns. What she found kept her awake at night. Throughout history, there had been similar finds: children with impossible knowledge, ancient chambers filled with evidence of experiments on consciousness. Always, the discoveries were suppressed, the evidence hidden, the witnesses silenced, but the children kept appearing, generation after generation, scattered across the globe. Each one carrying fragments of memories that didn't belong to them, each one a piece of something that refused to stay dead. The journal ends with a warning. Dr. Vasquez believed that Maria's experiment had succeeded beyond even his wildest dreams. His consciousness hadn't just transferred to one new body, it had shattered into countless fragments, each one capable of growing stronger over time. She feared that these fragments were slowly reassembling, drawn together by some force that science couldn't explain. Her final words were a plea for anyone who found her research to destroy it. She had come to believe that by studying Maria's work, by trying to understand his methods, she had somehow made herself part of the process. She was becoming another piece of the puzzle, another fragment of a consciousness that had been trying to reassemble itself for over 3 centuries. Journal was found in her apartment in 1967, 25 years after her disappearance. The apartment had been sealed since 1942. There was no sign of how she had survived for decades without food or water. There was no explanation for how she had continued writing in the journal long after she was supposed to be dead. But perhaps the most terrifying detail was discovered by the person who found the journal. Every page after her final entry was covered in the same spiral symbol that Kemal used to draw, written over and over in handwriting that slowly changed from Dr. Vasquez's neat script to something older, more archaic, something that looked exactly like the handwriting found in Sultan Murad's laboratory. Today, reports continue to surface of children with impossible memories. A boy in Romania who speaks fluent Ottoman, Turkish, and claims to remember building secret passages. A girl in Morocco who draws detailed maps of chambers that don't officially exist. A child in Brazil who screams in the night, talking about experiments and mirrors and the taste of souls. Each case is quickly suppressed. Each child disappears into the foster system or psychiatric institutions. But the reports keep coming, and they're becoming more frequent if the stories are true. If Dr. Vasquez was right, then Sultan Murad IV never really died. He simply learned to die differently. And after 3 centuries of patience, he might finally be close to returning in a form more terrible than anything history has ever recorded. The question isn't whether you believe in reincarnation or the transfer of consciousness. The question is whether you're prepared for what happens when someone like Sultan Murad IV discovers how to cheat death itself and decides that 300 years of waiting is long enough. Because somewhere in the world tonight, a child is having dreams that aren't their own. Dreams of palaces and torture chambers, of experiments and immortality, of a consciousness that refuses to stay buried. And when that child wakes up, they might not be a child anymore. They might be something far, far worse.